Sometimes, the people who think they hold the most power have no idea they're walking straight into their own downfall. In my quiet lakeside cabin, I wanted nothing more than a weekend of peace and privacy. But one woman known to everyone, as the neighborhood Karen, decided she could ignore every boundary, every law, and even common sense. She stormed into my property, ready to lecture, ready to control, ready to threaten. What she didn't know was that she had just walked into a meeting with one of the highest legal authorities in the entire state, and what happened after that would shake the entire homeowners association to its core. The lake always held a kind of calm that city life could never replicate. Tucked away among tall pines and rolling hills, my cabin was simple, built decades ago with a wraparound porch and creaky wooden floors that echoed with the sound of past summers. The HOA never had much reach out here. Technically, the cabin wasn't even within their jurisdiction, but that didn't stop Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of imaginary rules, from believing she had a right to control everything around her. That Friday evening I had arrived early. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet, and the lake shimmered like glass. I had one purpose, a private meeting. The state attorney general himself was driving in, and we had chosen this secluded cabin because it offered privacy and quiet to things that were critical for the conversation ahead. I moved through the cabin, making sure everything was prepared. Folders of documents were laid neatly on the oak table in the main room. Coffee was brewing in the small kitchen. The crackle of the stone fireplace filled the silence as I checked my watch, but peace is never guaranteed. When Karen is around, she had noticed my truck earlier, no doubt. She had probably called other neighbors, weaving theories about what I was doing here. In her mind, she ran the community. Her rules, her watchful eye, her constant interference. It didn't matter that she wasn't elected to any official position. She wore control like a badge of honor, and everyone else was supposed to fall in line that night. She decided she wouldn't just watch from afar. Around 7 o'clock. Headlights cut through the trees and a black SUV pulled up beside my cabin. The Attorney General had arrived. I walked out to greet him, and we shook hands firmly, exchanging quick words before heading inside. The meeting was confidential, but its weight was immense. Matters of local corruption, mismanagement, and the very HOA that Karen clung to for power. Inside. As we settled into our chairs, neither of us realized Karen had been lurking in the shadows near the tree line, watching like a hawk. The Attorney General opened the first folder, his voice calm but precise as he outlined the cases ahead. The documents were damning. There were complaints, financial inconsistencies, and evidence pointing to illegal enforcement tactics within the HOA. The state had been investigating quietly for months, and tonight was about pulling the threads together. But we weren't alone for long. Without warning, the cabin door creaked open. At first I thought maybe the wind had pushed it, but then came the sharp echo of footsteps on wooden floors. Karen, she didn't knock, she didn't announce herself. She simply marched right in as though the property belonged to her. Her eyes darted across the room, narrowing at the sight of the folders spread across the table, and then locking on the Attorney General. She didn't recognize him at first, too consumed by her own mission. Her voice rang sharp and accusing, filling the quiet space with unwanted noise. But before she could push her tirade any further, the Attorney General lifted his head, his expression calm but unyielding. He had the kind of presence that could silence a room without raising his voice. And in that moment, Karen realized she had walked into something far larger than her next petty complaint. Still, she didn't back down. Not yet. The cabin grew colder, quieter, the tension thick enough to choke the firelight. She stood there, hands on her hips, demanding answers, claiming violations, threatening consequences. She believed she was the one in control. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that her very name was already written in those folders on the table. The moment Karen stepped into the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. The warmth of the fire, the calm hum of the lake outside, and the quiet focus of the meeting evaporated under her intrusion. She filled the space like a storm cloud, her voice sharp, her posture rigid, her certainty unshaken. In her mind, she was standing on rightful ground. She saw herself as the enforcer, the gatekeeper, the protector of rules that only she believed existed. She accused, she pointed, she claimed violations that had no basis in law. She railed about property boundaries, about community standards, about who should and shouldn't be here. The words tumbled from her mouth without pause, each one louder than the last, as though sheer volume could prove her authority. But the Attorney General sat silently. He didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't even look away from her. His calm presence was like stone against her storm, unshaken and immovable. He let her rant, let her spill every ounce of indignation, until her voice grew shrill from overuse. Finally, his eyes lifted, and he spoke not with anger, not with force, but with a measured tone that carried more weight than all her shouting combined. He asked her who she was, why she believed she had the right to barge into someone else's property uninvited, and on what authority she claimed to enforce rules in a place that did not fall under her HOA's jurisdiction. For the first time, Karen faltered. Her words caught in her throat, and for a brief second she hesitated. But Karen's pride would never allow retreat. She puffed herself up again, insisting that she represented the community, that her role was to protect the integrity of the neighborhood. She spoke as though she were a sworn officer of the law, when in reality, she was nothing more than a self-appointed busybody with a clipboard and an inflated sense of power. The Attorney General leaned back in his chair, regarding her with a steady gaze. He reached for one of the folders on the table, sliding it open with deliberate calm. Inside were reports, complaints from residents, letters from homeowners, and signed affidavits detailing harassment, intimidation, and abuse of authority. Each one pointed back to the HOA leadership, and Karen's name was mentioned more than once. He didn't reveal the documents yet, but his silence was telling. He simply closed the folder and folded his hands, as if deciding how best to proceed. Meanwhile, I stood near the door, my frustration simmering. This meeting was supposed to be confidential, focused, critical, and here she was, barging in, violating boundaries, threatening to derail everything with her arrogance. But before I could speak, the Attorney General lifted a hand, silently telling me to hold back. He wanted to see where this would go. Karen continued her tirade, unaware she was digging her own grave. She accused me of illegal renovations, of unapproved gatherings, of breaking bylaws that didn't even apply to this cabin. Every sentence exposed her ignorance, but also her obsession. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was inventing them, weaving them into existence and expecting everyone to bow in compliance. The irony was almost too much. The Attorney General asked her a simple question. Did she have written authorization from the HOA to act on its behalf tonight? She hesitated again. Her answer was vague, evasive, full of half-truths and bravado. She claimed her position was understood, that the community trusted her, that she had every right to intervene. But when pressed for documentation, for proof, for a single signed directive, she had nothing. The silence after that question was damning. The fire popped in the hearth, the logs shifting as though punctuating her failure to answer. Still, she doubled down. She tried to mask her lack of authority with louder words, sharper tones, more dramatic accusations. She demanded to know what we were discussing, demanded access to the documents on the table, demanded compliance as though she were the law itself. The Attorney General finally rose from his chair. His presence filled the room in a way Karen never could. He introduced himself formally, his title spoken clearly, his authority unmistakable. The weight of his position crashed over her like a wave. Her face drained of color. For a moment, she looked as though she might collapse under the realization of who she had just confronted. But pride is a stubborn thing. Even when faced with undeniable authority, she clung to her false sense of power. She stammered, tried to backpedal, tried to twist her intrusion into a matter of community safety, but the damage was done. The Attorney General's voice sharpened, no longer measured but edged with authority. He told her she had trespassed, that her behavior was unacceptable, that her interference could be construed as obstruction. He didn't raise his voice, but every word struck like a hammer. Karen's confidence cracked. Her eyes darted to me, then to the door, as though searching for an escape. For the first time in her reign of intimidation, she was the one cornered, the one without control. But this was only the beginning, because what she didn't know was that her intrusion had just accelerated the Attorney General's investigation. What might have been a quiet review of documents was now a living demonstration of the very abuse of power the state had come to examine. She had walked straight into the evidence, handed it to him on a silver platter, and sealed her own fate. The cabin grew quiet again, her voice finally silenced. The Attorney General returned to his chair, sliding another folder open. He no longer had to prove the case against her. The proof had just walked in and announced itself. I leaned against the wall, my anger cooled by a sense of grim satisfaction. For years, neighbors had suffered under her harassment, her control, her false authority. And now, here she was, caught in the act by the one person who could finally put an end to it. The night was far from over. The meeting would continue, the investigation would deepen, and Karen's unraveling had only just begun. The air inside the cabin felt heavier after Karen's intrusion. The silence that followed her outburst wasn't peaceful, it was charged, thick with the weight of unspoken consequences. The Attorney General didn't waste time. He opened the next folder, his hands moving with deliberate calm, and began laying out evidence across the table. Page after page detailed misconduct. Financial ledgers showed discrepancies in HOA fees, money that had been collected but never properly accounted for. Records revealed selective enforcement, homeowners who had been fined or threatened for minor infractions, while others, often close to the HOA board, were spared entirely. And then there were the personal accounts, each written in frustration and exhaustion, describing how Karen had harassed, intimidated, and even trespassed onto private property under the guise of enforcing rules. Every page was a mirror held up to the woman who had just stormed through the cabin door. Karen shifted uncomfortably, her bravado faltering as the Attorney General placed the evidence in plain view. She tried to defend herself, claiming misunderstandings, claiming that neighbors exaggerated, claiming her actions had been for the good of the community. But her words fell flat. The documents didn't lie. Asterisk, the Attorney General didn't shout, he didn't need to. His calm, methodical explanations cut deeper than any raised voice could. Each piece of evidence was like a nail, hammered into the coffin of her credibility. He spoke of laws violated, of due process ignored, of rights trampled. He described how the HOA had stepped far beyond its legal authority, transforming from an organization meant to maintain order into a tool of control. Asterisk, Karen's face flushed red, then pale. She clutched at excuses, insisting that every action had been justified, that she was only doing what needed to be done. But the Attorney General countered each claim with precision, pointing to statutes, to case law, to the rights of homeowners that she had trampled underfoot. Asterisk, I watched quietly, a sense of vindication growing in my chest. For years, neighbors had whispered about Karen's overreach, but whispers were never enough to stop her. Fear kept them silent. Fear of retaliation, fear of fines, fear of endless harassment. But now, under the scrutiny of the state's top legal authority, her reign of intimidation was unraveling before my eyes. Asterisk, the Attorney General leaned forward, sliding one final document across the table. It was an affidavit, signed by multiple residents, detailing a specific incident of Karen forcing entry into a neighbor's backyard, threatening fines for unauthorized decorations that posed no violation of any law. Her signature was on the violation notice, a paper trail that made her denial meaningless. Asterisk, she froze, her hands trembling slightly as her eyes scanned the paper. The weight of her own actions stared back at her in black ink. Asterisk, the fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the cabin as the moment stretched long and tense. Asterisk, Karen tried one last tactic. She claimed that without her, the community would collapse, that her strict oversight was necessary to keep order, to protect property values, to maintain standards. She painted herself as a martyr, the only one willing to shoulder the burden of responsibility. Asterisk, but the Attorney General was unmoved. He explained calmly that no individual had the right to place themselves above the law, that homeowners associations were bound by legal frameworks, by checks and balances, and that her behavior represented not protection but abuse. He warned her, in clear terms, that trespassing, harassment, and misuse of HOA authority carried legal consequences that were now inevitable. The room seemed smaller, the walls closing in around her. For the first time, Karen's voice wavered. The iron certainty that had carried her into the cabin was cracking, revealing fear beneath. Asterisk, she glanced at the door again, as though escape might erase what had been laid bare. But there was no escape, not from the evidence, not from the law, not from the reality that her power was slipping through her fingers. Asterisk. The Attorney General gathered the documents into a neat stack, his movements deliberate and final. He told her the investigation would proceed formally, that subpoenas would be issued, that her actions would be scrutinized in a courtroom, not in the living room of frightened neighbors. Asterisk, Karen opened her mouth as though to protest, but no words came. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst she had made earlier. Asterisk, I sat back, watching the collapse of someone who had built their identity on dominance and control. The HOA had shielded her for years, but here, in this cabin, stripped of pretense, her empire of intimidation was crumbling. Asterisk, the Attorney General stood, his presence commanding as he gathered his coat. The meeting had shifted from a quiet discussion of documents to a live demonstration of the very abuse he had come to investigate. In his eyes, the case was no longer theoretical, it was personal, witnessed firsthand. Asterisk, Karen's downfall had only just begun. The investigation would widen, the evidence would grow, and the HOA itself would come under a scrutiny it could never withstand. Asterisk, but this night, in this cabin, was the spark, and the fire it would ignite could not be contained. The night outside had deepened, the lake now a black mirror reflecting only the faint glimmer of the moon. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned, though its glow felt different, less like comfort, more like a spotlight on the unraveling of a woman who had once ruled her community with unchecked arrogance. Asterisk, Karen lingered near the center of the room, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She no longer barked accusations, no longer raised her voice. Her silence was defensive, not reflective. Her mind was working desperately, searching for an escape, for some shred of control to reclaim. But the Attorney General wasn't finished. He began to outline what would happen next. His voice was calm, steady, clinical. Subpoenas would be filed against the HOA board. A forensic audit of the association's financial records would be conducted. Witnesses would be called to testify, and sworn statements would be taken from homeowners who had endured years of harassment. The list of legal actions was long, and each one tightened the noose around Karen's influence. Every word landed like a hammer blow. She shifted uneasily, but her pride was a stubborn shield. She tried to laugh it off, a brittle, humorless sound that fell flat against the weight of the moment. She accused him of overreach, claimed this was unnecessary, exaggerated, even ridiculous. But her protests were weak, more reflex than conviction. Asterisk, the Attorney General didn't argue with her. He didn't need to. The evidence was already overwhelming, and her behavior tonight had spoken louder than any document could. Instead, he turned to me, asking about my experiences with the HOA. I hesitated for a moment, then began to speak. I told him about the threats I had received over my property, about the false violation notices stuffed into my mailbox, about the constant surveillance, the way Karen would park near my home just to watch, waiting for the smallest excuse to strike. I spoke of neighbors fined for harmless decorations, for lawn chairs on porches, for paint colors that supposedly violated standards no one had ever voted on. The Attorney General listened carefully, his pen scratching across a legal pad as he took notes. Each detail added another layer to the case, another thread in the web of abuse. Karen shifted uncomfortably as I spoke, her jaw tightening, her glare sharp. She didn't interrupt, but her silence was full of rage. When I finished, he set his pen down and leaned back, his expression unreadable but his focus clear. He explained that stories like mine were not isolated, they were part of a larger pattern, one that had already surfaced in the state's investigation. My testimony, combined with the evidence already collected, painted a damning picture. Karen broke her silence then, lashing out in desperation. She accused me of exaggeration, of lying, of conspiring against her. She claimed that homeowners had twisted the truth, that she was the victim of a smear campaign. But her words rang hollow. Her outburst only reinforced the image of a woman, consumed by control, unwilling to accept accountability. The Attorney General stood once more, his presence commanding the space. He told Karen bluntly that she was no longer free to act as she pleased, that her actions would be reviewed in court, that the state would ensure justice was served, not just for me, but for every homeowner she had tormented. Her defiance crumbled further. She protested weakly, her voice no longer sharp but trembling. She tried to bargain, insisting she had acted with good intentions, that she had only wanted to maintain order. But intention did not erase the harm. Good intentions could not excuse harassment, trespassing, or financial misconduct. The Attorney General didn't linger on her excuses. He gathered his documents, stacking them neatly and sliding them into his briefcase. His movements carried a sense of finality, as though the night's revelations had sealed Karen's fate. I watched as Karen stood rigid, her pride and fear warring silently. She wasn't used to losing, she wasn't used to being challenged, and she had certainly never been cornered like this. The Attorney General walked to the door, his coat draped over one arm. Before leaving, he turned to me and nodded a silent assurance that justice was already in motion. Then he glanced at Karen, his gaze steady, unflinching. He told her she would be hearing from his office very soon. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed through the cabin, final and heavy. Karen and I were left in the silence of the firelight, the crackle of the flames filling the space between us. She avoided my eyes, staring instead at the floorboards, her shoulders tense. For the first time, she looked small not in stature, but in power. But pride is a dangerous thing. Even as the reality of her situation settled in, I could see the flicker of defiance still burning in her eyes. She wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. She would fight, she would scheme, she would twist and claw to preserve what little power she thought remained. I knew then that the battle wasn't over. The Attorney General had left, but his investigation was just beginning. Karen would not go quietly, and the fallout from this night would ripple through the community, shaking every homeowner, every board member, every false sense of security that had allowed her reign to continue for so long. The tide had turned, but the storm was far from finished. The days following that night at the cabin were anything but quiet. The Attorney General's office moved swiftly, sending formal notices, requesting records, and calling homeowners to give testimony. Subpoenas landed on the HOA board's desk like thunderclaps, rattling the leadership that had long believed themselves untouchable. For the first time, cracks began to show in the foundation of Karen's influence. Board members who had once echoed her every word now whispered doubts behind closed doors. Some quietly reached out to investigators, eager to distance themselves before the storm consumed them too. But Karen refused to surrender. She doubled down, rallying what allies she still had, calling emergency meetings, spinning stories about government overreach and attacks on the community. She painted herself as a victim of a witch hunt, insisting that outsiders were conspiring to tear down the neighborhood she had worked so hard to protect. Her words carried the same hollow authority, but fewer people were listening now. Still, she fought. Violation notices appeared in mailboxes at a frantic pace, almost as if she were trying to prove she still held power. Neighbors were cited for garden gnomes, for paint colors, for trash cans visible from the street, even for curtains not deemed uniform. Her aggression intensified, desperate and wild, as though punishing others could hold back the tide of consequences closing in on her. But fear no longer silenced the community. Homeowners who once cowered under her threats now spoke freely. They filed complaints directly with the Attorney General's office, sharing stories that had festered in silence for years. They compared notes, realizing together that they weren't alone, that Karen's harassment had touched almost everyone in some way. The community that had once bowed to her was beginning to rise against her, asterisk, and yet, Karen didn't stop. Asterisk, one evening, I noticed her SUV parked near my driveway, her headlights off, her figure barely visible behind the wheel. She wasn't there by accident. She was watching, waiting, trying to intimidate me into silence. When I stepped outside, she didn't move. She just sat there, her presence a silent threat. Eventually, she drove off. But the message was clear: she wasn't finished with me. Asterisk, the Attorney General had warned me this could happen. When people like Karen are cornered, they lash out, clinging to control with every desperate tactic they can muster. But he assured me the law was on my side, and that every misstep she made now only strengthened the case against her. Asterisk, and missteps came quickly. Asterisk, during a heated HOA meeting, recorded by multiple residents, Karen erupted into a tirade, shouting down anyone who dared question her authority. She dismissed the subpoenas as meaningless, claimed she had nothing to hide, and declared that she would fight the state itself if she had to. Her words were reckless, her voice cracking with anger. The recordings circulated among homeowners, and eventually reached the Attorney General's office. Asterisk, it became yet another piece of evidence, proof of her abuse, her defiance, her unwillingness to operate within the bounds of the law. Asterisk, still, she pressed on. Asterisk, she tried to pressure board members into loyalty, threatening to expose secrets, to dig into their personal lives, to drag them down with her if they turned against her. But fear no longer worked. More and more of them broke away, choosing to cooperate with investigators instead of shielding her. Asterisk, her power was crumbling, but her desperation made her dangerous. Asterisk, one night I returned to the cabin to find the porch light shattered, glass scattered across the wooden steps. It could have been coincidence. It could have been the wind or a stray branch. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Karen was sending messages, small acts of intimidation designed to remind me that she wasn't finished. Asterisk, the Attorney General's office advised me to stay calm, to document everything, to let them handle it. They were building a case not just against the HOA but against Karen personally. Every action she took now was evidence. Every threat another nail in the coffin of her authority. Asterisk, the community felt it too. The whispers had become open conversations. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact in the past now gathered in driveways, discussing the end of her reign. There was fear, yes, but there was also hope. A hope that had been absent for far too long. Asterisk, Karen was losing her grip, but she wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Her pride wouldn't let her step aside quietly. She would go down swinging, dragging as many people with her as she could. Asterisk, and as the days passed, I realized that the storm wasn't easing, it was only building towards something bigger, something final. Asterisk, the showdown was coming. The storm that had been building for weeks finally broke. Subpoenas turned into court dates, testimonies piled higher than Karen could ever counter. The evidence was overwhelming: financial misconduct, selective enforcement, trespassing, harassment. It was no longer just suspicion or whispered complaints. It was a mountain of proof, presented before a judge who had no patience for arrogance disguised as authority. Asterisk, the courtroom was packed the morning of the hearing. Homeowners filled the benches, many of them people Karen had intimidated for years. Their faces carried a mix of anxiety and anticipation, the tension of finally confronting the one who had ruled their lives with iron fists and empty threats. Asterisk, Karen sat at the defendant's table, her posture rigid, her jaw clenched. Gone was the loud, domineering figure who once barked orders and demanded obedience. Here, under oath, she was stripped of her shield of control. Her voice trembled as she tried to defend herself, her excuses unraveling under the weight of cross-examination. Asterisk, the Attorney General's office laid out the case methodically. Financial records showed thousands of dollars in unaccounted HOA fees. Witnesses testified about harassment, intimidation, and fabricated violations. Video recordings and affidavits told a consistent story. Karen had wielded power like a weapon, targeting neighbors for her own pride and control. Asterisk, her attempts to explain only dug the hole deeper. She insisted everything she did was for the good of the community, but good intentions couldn't erase the paper trail, the broken laws, or the bruised trust of dozens of homeowners. Asterisk, one by one, the people she had wronged stood up and told their stories. Each voice added to the chorus of truth, painting a picture of life under Karen's watchful eye, of constant fear, of arbitrary punishments, of the slow erosion of peace in their own homes. Asterisk, by the time it was over, there was no doubt left. The judge ruled decisively. The HOA board would be restructured under state oversight, and Karen was permanently barred from holding any position of authority within the association. She was found personally liable for harassment and trespassing and faced steep fines alongside the possibility of further civil suits from neighbors she had wronged. Asterisk, the gavel struck, and with it, Karen's reign ended. Asterisk, the community exhaled as though a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. People who had once avoided eye contact in fear now embraced, their relief spilling into smiles and laughter. The HOA, once a weapon of intimidation, would be rebuilt into what it was meant to be: a framework for fairness, not a tool for tyranny. Asterisk, as for Karen, She left the courtroom in silence, her head bowed, her pride shattered. The woman who once believed herself untouchable had been brought down not by force, but by the law she had ignored. Weeks later, I returned to the lake cabin, the place where this story had begun. The air was calm, the water still, the fire and the hearth crackling once again. But this time, there was peace. Real peace. Not the fragile kind threatened by Karen's interference. Neighbors visited freely, stopping by to thank me, to thank the Attorney General, to share stories of their newfound freedom. The community that had once lived in shadows was now stepping into the light. And as I looked across the lake, I thought about how it all started: one woman's arrogance, one intrusion, one moment where she believed herself untouchable. But power built on fear never lasts. It collapses the moment truth steps in. Karen had busted into my cabin that night, believing she was in control. What she didn't realize was that she had walked straight into the one room where her control meant nothing, into the hands of the state's highest authority, and into the moment her downfall began. Her story was over. But for the rest of us, a new chapter was only just beginning. And that's how one woman's obsession with control brought her entire empire crashing down. Karen thought she could bend the law, intimidate her neighbors, and even trespass into private property without consequence. But the truth always comes out, and when it did, her reign ended in the very place she never expected: inside a courtroom. Remember, no matter how much power someone thinks they hold, they can never stand above the law. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more HOA tales. Your support helps bring more true drama from neighborhoods just like this one.